Great, excellent. I always forget to do that, so that's great. Here we go. Okay, so again, welcome everyone, and it's really a pleasure to have you all with us. I'm going to say something very brief on our session, on our series rather. So this is a series that Hatoun and myself started in December 2021, and we have taken advantage of this Zoom platform to reach out beyond the city of Manchester to many other cities and to the world. And it's really a joy to gather from wherever you are to discuss issues relating to the empowerment of Muslim women through literature, the art, and social sciences. We now running our ninth lecture of our second year. We have one more to go for this year. So this makes it 10 lectures every year. And we are enthused actually by our audiences to prepare for a third year. This is really a good platform for us to discuss openly issues relating to women and gender. And we have dealt with, or rather we had guests speaking on all areas, be it literature, history, arts. And today we have Professor Hoda Elsadda with us, who is going to talk to us about the Feminist Archive in Cairo. I think my colleague Hatoun is going to introduce her. So welcome again, and over to you, Hatoun.
Thank you, Zahia. Welcome all. Professor Hoda Elsadda is a very well-known person to every feminist in the Arab world. She's an Egyptian feminist activist, professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University. This is just the very, very brief, by the way, note of what Dr. Hoda Elsadda represents. She's also a co-founder of the Women and Memory Forum, the one that we are, that is the subject of today's talk. Her research interests are in the areas of gender studies, comparative literature, and oral history. She's the author of Gender, Nation, and Arabic and the Arabic novel, Egypt between 1892 and 2008, and the co-editor of Oral History in Times of Change, Gender Documentation, and the Making of Archives in 2018. These are the latest publications of Professor Hoda, but anybody is interested in her full CV could consult the site of Cairo University, and formerly with Manchester University as well. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Hoda today, and to hear some of her experience in founding this very important think tank, women think tank in Egypt and for the Arab world. The floor is yours.
You are muted, Hoda.
Muted, yeah.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you very, very much. First of all, it's really wonderful to be, seeing old friends, even if it's, online, but still, thank you, Zoom. And of course, I want to thank Professor Zahia Salhi and Professor Hatoun Al-Fassi for inviting me to participate in this lecture series. Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. So I was asked to speak about my work in the Women and Memory Forum, which is a research organization based in Egypt. It's a feminist research organization. And we always say that we are a group of feminist academics, activists, and our intellectual projects aim to challenge dominant narratives about gender roles and intervene in the construction and dissemination of new knowledges that encourage a rethinking of unequal power relations and structures. Women in Memory began as an idea in 1995, and it was amongst a small group of academics / researchers, activists. And over the years, it grew into a feminist research center. So, there's a long process here that can be told. We, the group, we see ourselves as part of the feminist movement in the Arab world, as well as the feminist transnational movement for justice. Now, each member of the group has her own specific research project, but that is compatible with and complementary to the overarching feminist vision of women in memory. So for example, and I'll just refer to people you already know, I think most of you. So, and this is not meant to be a comprehensive list at all of my colleagues, but just to give you a sense of how we function. So for example, my colleague Hala Kamel is interested in feminist translation studies in particular, amongst other things, but this is what she focuses on in her work in Women in Memory. Umayma Abu Bakr works in the field of Islamic feminism, again, and this is what she focuses on. Just to give you two examples, really. Now, the main focus of my work in the context of Women in Memory is oral history, and particularly establishing an oral history archive of women's voices. At the same time, we, the group, collaborate and work together in the various projects that we undertake. So producing translations, we do a lot of teaching of education workshops, we call them, on gender studies, publishing and participating in advocacy campaigns. Now, Women in Memory is essentially a feminist intellectual project with an activist agenda. So I will try in this talk to touch on these two aspects of our work, the research and the activism. And I will argue that they complement and consolidate each other. So our research informs our activism, and our activism inspires our research agenda. Now, in this talk, I've described the Women in Memory as a feminist archive. And I'm using archive both literally and metaphorically. So literally, an archive is a place, it could be virtual or physical, which curates documents, historical sources, people, materials in diverse forms and genres. That's one sense, but also metaphorically, as used by cultural theorists as a metaphor for knowledge production as part of the machinations of power. So I'm using the archive here in these two senses. Now, so very generally, and again, I have to be brief, the Women in Memory Feminist Archive has three main components. One, the Women in Memory Documentation and Research and Resource Center, which is a specialized library that consists of material produced in Arabic in the field of women and gender studies, with particular focus on gray literature. What is gray literature? This is literature, books, materials of limited circulation, not easily accessible, not necessarily cataloged in libraries. So we're thinking here of conference papers, but also, and this is really, I really want to stress this, it also includes most of the publications and books produced and published by NGOs, feminist NGOs in the Arab world over the last 3 decades. Most of these publications you can't find in bookshops. Most of these publications are not necessarily made available in libraries. So even these publications, which are really important because this is like the sum total of knowledge production in Arabic in the field of women and gender studies, can be characterized as gray literature. But we also have in this resource private collection of papers, private papers of Egyptian women. So this is a resource that we value a lot. So for example, we have the private papers of Wadad Mitri, who was a famous unionist, very, very important person, definitely in the history of Egypt. We also try to collect rare books and magazines relevant to women and gender studies, a photo library, and a film library. And so this is like a general idea. And the idea is to have all these resources in one place, made available to researchers and made accessible. We try to digitize, but obviously this is a very long process. Now, the idea of this resource, the idea behind it, is to address the difficulties in the circulation of knowledge produced in Arabic in the Arab world. There is an issue, of course. We don't have an Arab Amazon. We don't have an Arab database, unfortunately. And also to enable access, but also to preserve and make available important documents relevant to women's memory. And I will just mention briefly that one of the components of this resource is a database we've developed entitled Who is She? And this is a database of women professionals in Egypt. So basically biographical information about women professionals in Egypt. And yeah, that's part of the resource. Now, the second leg of this of archive is the production of specialized feminist knowledge in Arabic. The title of our first project, I think, is in the 1990s, is actually telling. It was Rewriting Arab Cultural History from a Feminist Perspective. That was the first project that we decided to embark on. Now, at the time, of course, it sounded a bit too grand. When we first started, we always apologized about, being too, choosing this really grand title. But, when I reflect on it now, it does encapsulate what we are still trying to do. Mm-hmm. And so we also emphasize the necessity of writing and publishing in Arabic, and this is really important, which again consolidated our vision to challenge both patriarchal narratives as well as colonial narratives and the coloniality of knowledge production, which is something that is being discussed at length these days. Mm. The final component, the last leg, I call it, of our archive is the Oral History Archive of Women's Voices. And this is what I would like to elaborate on a little bit in this talk. Now, so I will try to respond to the following questions. What is a feminist archive? Why is it important? And for the sake of time, I will focus this intervention on the Oral History Archive of Voices and elaborate on some of the issues and challenges that we face, again, as clearly, but also as briefly as possible. I will argue that the act of archiving women's stories is an activist act, that stories matter as knowledge and as methodology for campaigning for social change. I will share briefly lessons learned from an activist campaign at the end to illustrate the point made earlier, which is sort of like this sentence, which I really subscribe to: our research informs our activism and our activism inspires our research agenda. So what is a feminist archive and why is it important? One of the main projects undertaken by Women in Memory is the creation of an oral history archive of women. This started in the 1990s, and the documentation of these narratives started in the 1990s, second half of the 90s, and has continued ever since, punctuated with periods of disruptions. We can talk about these periods perhaps later on. The collections are diverse, but all geared towards spotlighting women's voices and experiences. The first collection we worked on consisted of life stories of, we call them pioneering women, al-ra'idat. And these are the women who had started their careers in the early 20th century as professionals or were actively involved in public life. The work began at the end of the 90s, as I said, and now these oral narratives shed light on the lives of women who ventured into the public sphere in the first half of the 20th century. Many of them can be described as trailblazers of women's advent into the public sphere in the modern period. Many confronted challenges and constraints, but their stories are really diverse, but also very complex, because they tell of moments of success as well as defeat, perseverance and courage, but also weakness, regrets. It's very, very interesting. So we're not into, celebrating, for successes only. It's really about understanding experiences, understanding, social dynamics. And of course, these life experiences offered novel insights into our understanding of Egyptian political and social history. Now, these stories in general, on the whole, can be read as stories of resistance and dissent, resistance to social norms, but also resistance to political oppression and unjust systems. Another collection of oral histories that we documented consists of narratives of women who were inspired by the revolutionary wave that swept Egypt in 2011. And these are, of course, stories of hope and commitment to change, but also of disappointment, frustration in the face of radical transformations and changes in the body politic. Now, these oral narratives we think of as key historical sources for understanding our social and political history.